Hello, welcome to the third part of our workshop, which involves learning about Ansible playbooks. So where we left off, we had built a simple configuration server and um, and we learned how to connect two machines together so that we could send configuration commands through SSH and then through manual Ansible commands. And where we left off, we saw that doing ad hoc commands in Ansible could be pretty cool, but we needed some way to organize these things into scripts that we could reuse and build larger sets of configurations with. And that's where an Ansible playbook comes in. Now, for the rest of this workshop, we're going to dig into some of the concepts related to Ansible and then play around with running and writing some playbooks. So there will be some activities at the end. But the main idea here is to learn the concepts that are involved. There aren't many good resources for learning about the big picture here. And so I thought first we would focus on that. And there's plenty of chances to learn how to do specific tasks within Ansible and get help at that level, and you'll have lots of chance to practice that. But there isn't many things that explain the concept, so that's what we're going to do. So one thing that you probably want to do is you want to double check to see, does your setup still work? And the reason for that is it may not be because if you turned off your computer, your laptop, one of the things that might happen is your servers might hibernate or go off, right? So you can see here, if I do close, save state, you're going to have, that's usually what will happen when you first turn on your laptop or if your computer rebooted. And what you'll want to do in that case is you'll want to go back to the configuration management part one step and go back to the server that you want to bring back online and run the step for that. And luckily what will happen here is instead of recreating the VM and you having to run any steps, it's simply just going to help run the start command for you. But more importantly, it's also going to run some of the other post configuration steps like setting the IP address. So if you were to just manually start that, then it would be missing that information. So this would be the ideal way to turn that stuff back on if you need to. So you could see I am back online and ready to rock and roll. So when this is done, you'll see I was able to use the ping module. But what if I wanted to write this as a playbook? And so that's what I have here. So here's a YAML file that has the ping module here, but then it also has all this other stuff. And what is that? So we'll explain that. And we could run the same thing here. Instead of running it with the Ansible command, we're now running this with the Ansible playbook. And then we're sending this file and the inventory that we have. And you can see it has similar output where it says task ping all the host. And it gives a little summary of all the things that were done in the playbook. And so we'll see more examples of that. But before getting into the nitty gritty of Ansible playbooks, one important thing to understand is really just YAML, because it turns out that Ansible is really just mostly writing and understanding YAML. That's the syntax that all the playbooks are written in. And YAML just stands for yet another markup language, or YAML ain't markup language, depending on which acronym you want to pick. And there are nice resources for understanding the syntax of it. But really the best way to kind of think of YAML is it's really just another syntax for representing something like JSON, which is basically objects, properties with list values, strings, etc. Right? And we'll get a little bit into that. But one kind of interesting way to understand YAML is just to play around with a string and then just start printing out some of the things that you see in it. So here is a YAML string right here. And we use this library to load it up. And I'm just going to start printing out some stuff and then see what we get. Oops. Okay. Okay, so when I print out the top property, what you see is that's actually just an object that has two property values, children and a task property. And then inside the children, you'll see that this is actually a list, right? So these things here, this is the same thing as saying in an array, right? And this task property is the same thing as saying there's a list. You see by these little two dots of two objects, right? And so this object is going to be a property here, this name property and this app property. So you could see right here is the key and then the value and then also the key and value. And then as you can imagine, this could be as nested as you want, right? But that really is the fundamental properties of a YAML document. And there's way more details in terms of like how do you quote strings and deal with other characters. And if you want to see more about that, you can keep playing with this other interactive notebook that goes into more detail about parsing YAML. But I just thought that would be a neat exercise for if you want to play around with a YAML structure. But let's go back to our example, the ping example, and let's try to break down each part to see what does it all mean. And so let's start with the very first line, which is this 3 dashes. So that is an optional headline that denotes the start of a YAML document. And sometimes you can use that to put other meta properties above it that are just document-based properties. But Ansible doesn't tend to use those too much. So then here is the thing that is interesting. So the top level object of a playbook is actually a list of plays. So each play represents kind of the highest level object or things that you want to do. And that starts off with a list, right? So you have a list, and then we're going to start off with a property host, right? And so there's a host property all, and then all refers to all the things that are in our inventory. So in our case, if we had an inventory that looked something like this, then it would refer to each one of these entries, a mail server, some web servers, DB servers, etc. If you wanted to refer to a subset of things, like say just the web servers, you could put host web servers. And then what that would do is it would mean that this play only applies to the web servers. And it makes it easy to run things on, install, MySQL only on the database servers and not the web servers. So it makes it easy for you to say, what does this apply to? One other thing that you can do with host is you could also refer to localhost, which means running it on the server that Ansible is on itself, or where you're running the Ansible Playbook command from, and it will just run that locally. Okay, well, what's the next line? The next line up here, see the gather facts? So gather facts? No. So what it's saying here is that when we connect over to the server over SSH, there are chances that you may want to gather some more information about the host. And so what it usually does, it will run special Python modules for gathering different statistics and states about the server, like what's its IP address and all this sort of stuff. So I point this out for two reasons. One, because there are times where you want to turn this off for performance reasons, because if you're gathering all that information and you're not using it in your playbook, you're going to really slow down how fast it takes for you to do something. But the more important point is there are some times where you might expect that server to have issues or be down. And if you were to have gather facts yes, which is the default, then you actually are going to get into an error state of where you can never actually make a connection to the server. And that kind of messes up stuff. So for example, when we're doing the ping command, we're kind of assuming that we may not be able to reach the servers. And if we're making the assumption that we can get facts about the server, we would actually never get to the point of running the ping command. And so turning off fact gathering allows us to do that. Another example of where that might occur, this is if you have an image that is missing a Python environment, which is required for Ansible, then one pattern you might see is you would turn off gather facts, then run a raw command for installing a minimum environment for Python, and then have a new play where you would then do your normal stuff. Okay, so that's a little bit off the sidetrack, but it's kind of important because it reveals kind of the inner workings of what Ansible is doing when it makes a connection. All right, so here is the heart of Ansible. Then this next line. So task. So the task property will contain a list of objects, and each object represents a task that you're going to be doing in a playbook. And generally, a task is just a command that you're running that uses some sort of module. Okay, so in this case, here's a task object, and it has this name property, and this is just information only, and it's the thing that gets printed when you run the playbook. So these are really useful for having kind of readable playbooks. You want to know what step is being run. So having something nice and descriptive here is important. Then here we're simply giving the ping module, and we're saying that's the task, is to use this. And notice that there's no arguments for ping. So it's just the object by itself, just the property by itself. While we're here, it's also worth pointing out that when you write a playbook, you might see two different styles, which I refer to as inline versus explicit. And in the inline style, what you're basically doing is you're taking a property and you're giving the kind of like object that it's going to, kind of like the other inner properties and object it's going to have, as all one string, right? And you notice that this actually could be represented this other way, where if I indent two spaces over, as long as it's consistent, that's all that matters, then I have my package property with Node.js and the property state with the value present, right? And so that's the same thing as saying package equals Node.js and then state equals present. Okay, so both of these styles are okay, and there are reasons to do one or the other, but they're essentially the same thing. All right, so that kind of breaks down what YAML is, what a playbook has, but what are some of the higher level concepts associated with playbooks? All right, so let's get into that. So as I alluded to before, really the heart of Ansible is its modules. So it has just a great library of different modules that you can use for running all sorts of commands. And just to give you an example of a couple of different things you can do, there's modules for installing packages and using package managers. So like the app module will make it very easy to install anything that you want, and add little tweaks like, please don't install recommends. There are modules for doing things like manage the server, the service state, like make sure that the web server service is in the state started. And there are lots of operations for dealing with file content. So copying things over from one place to the other, using templates, setting the permissions of files. So there are all sorts of nice operations. And this is only a small subset. And so one of my favorite things to do, and what I like about Ansible, is really just to browse its documentation for the modules. So if you look at what they have, it's usually always the same thing. It's the name of the module and then all the parameters that you can give for that. And it's kind of useful to know, is it default and do you have to provide it and get the detailed thing? But usually what I like to do is I jump straight to the examples and I just kind of see what's an example I might want to use. So in this one, this is useful for your most basic install some sort of package and make sure that apt-get update is run first, remove a package, and what if I need a specific version? Well, then here's the syntax I do that. So usually you could kind of find what you need to do in the documentation itself, and you just kind of copy and adapt that for your situation. So this is really super useful to look at and browse. So that's all the modules. Another important thing about Ansible is the variables that you can use. So not everything is going to be known ahead of time. There might be some parameters that you have to provide, and you don't want to hard code certain things in your configuration scripts. So this is a good example of if I wanted a script that's going to be generic to a user and group, then I could provide these as variables. So variables are going to work by using something similar to handlebars, where I have these curly braces, then the variable name, and curly braces. And in modern Ansible, that has to be in quotes. So variables, the hard part about variables is how you get them into the playbook really varies. There's all sorts of ways to do that. You could put a variable property as part of the high level playbook and just put some stuff there, and that's okay for some things. You can also include another external file with that includes variables. You could get them kind of like inherited from roles, or depending on if you put them in a directory structure in a certain place, then they can be associated with the host, for example. So variables come all over the place, and I would recommend that you look up in detail how that works. But for just starting out, just doing something like this or an external file is usually pretty good. You can also you can also prompt for a variable or pass it on the command line. And I don't generally recommend that unless there is a weird exception or use case for that. Another interesting thing about Ansible is loops, and then other things that are kind of like this. So this sort of gets into the programming part of Ansible. And so the example here is, imagine you had a list of variables called packages, and it was just all the packages that you wanted to install in something. And then you wanted to kind of run multiple commands associated with that. And so the way that would look like in Ansible is you could use the with items property associated with the task itself and pass that as a variable. And then what would happen is it would then use a new kind of implicit variable called item that would have the particular item in the list that you want, and it will call this 3 times. And then when you see the playbook run, you'll see each one of those items being printed out. Now, modern Ansible actually recommends directly passing a list now, so that's supported in the app module. But there are other use cases like this where this pattern still works. And so this might be a common thing that you want to do if you kind of need to do multiple actions based on the contents of a list. Another one of my favorite things provided by Ansible are templates. So many times you have, when you're setting up some sort of server, something that involves configuration files, where it's going to be variables that you have to fill in, or something like passwords, and you want to be able to have this filled in, then what you can do is you can use the kind of similar variable syntax in the file itself, and then you will use the template module and say, all right, here's my source is this template, and then copy it over to this destination, right? And then what it will do is it will fill in that file with the variables that are in your Playbooks environment. And so it's a really useful way to just be able to have a generic template and then fill it in dynamically with your environment state. And the template logic could be fairly sophisticated, so it does account for things like loops and conditionals as well. So you could do some sophisticated file generation with Ansible. And then just a final thing, this will come up later, but you can also use Ansible to store secrets in Ansible Vault. And the way this basically works is that Ansible Vault will encrypt your content, either as the whole file to be encrypted, or even inline into a variable file. It will help encrypt it for you. And then there's all sorts of tools for being able to read and access that stuff so that at runtime, when you're running the playbook, it would have access to those things. But when you check in your configuration, that's going to be all encrypted. So it helps keep those stuff a little bit more secure. And so in the project, you'll definitely have a chance to play with that. Okay, so that's enough, I think, high-level information. I think it's important at this point to just be able to play around with a couple examples. And so here I have this terminal, and if you look inside of Baker X and examples, you'll see a couple different playbooks already there. And so we'll run a couple of these and see what they do. So for example, the first thing I'm gonna look at is Baker X examples and then commands. And you can see that this is using all the things that we talked about. Here's variables and some tasks. So these two, the first task is using the file module to make sure that an SSH directory exists. And then it's going to use the user module to basically use this little utility for generating SSH key. And so basically this is just a useful command that we might want to have for making sure we have an SSH key generated for a user. So I'm running that playbook, and that's just running it locally on my host. And then here again, you can see the output of it. So it's saying the play was run on the local host. And it's going to say each task that it did, the gather facts first, then the task for ensuring the SSH directory exists, and then it generates a SSH key. And you can see changed is mentioned here because the task itself was actually executed. So it lets you know that the state of the system was actually changed. And you can see in the summary here, change equals 1. Now, if I run it again, what I should see is the same playbook happen again, but it's going to say that the change state is 0 because it was already done. So you just see this OK localhost and changed is 0. Now, if I look at my SSH directory and I see that there's these two things, if I were to remove those keys and then run it again, you're going to see that it will now notice that those things aren't there, and it will regenerate them. All right, and this kind of gives you another example of the idempotence property that's important about Ansible. So that's pretty cool. And I mean, here's a good reason why you wouldn't want this to necessarily happen each time, where each time you ran a playbook that it generated a new key, because then that means you're going to have to register that with all other sorts of things down the line, make it very unstable, versus if it's kind of like, look, one time this should be generated. It's kind of where you want stuff to be. Okay. So that was cool. That was an interesting example. But here is another playbook. This kind of a fragment of one. And in this one, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to install Node.js on our web server, which isn't there. All right. And so in this case, what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to fill in, and then this is a good place where I'm just going to try to see if I can remember what the syntax is. So I'm going to do host all, because that's going to include everything that's in the inventory. Then I need to make sure, and task is part of this object, so I don't do anything with that. Then I have name app state. All right, and we're create this file. And that is going to be at Baker X examples node. Okay, and I'm going to try running. So I could just use this if I want. Now, no idea, is this going to work? Is there going to be problems? Probably. This is the first time that I was doing this. Okay. And here is a good thing that you're going to see all the time in Ansible. You're going to see some sort of error, and then you're going to have to understand what went wrong. So I could see that here's my task that was being run. So that's good, because the fact that it did this, it meant it was able to parse my YAML. And it means it at least understood what I was trying to do, which is good, because a lot of times you actually have to deal with syntax errors. So it understood what I was trying to do, but it said that when it tried to run the command, that there was something wrong. So let's dig through, and then eventually I see this error: could not open lock file, permission denied. Okay, well, what that basically means is that I haven't run the command in a privileged state, right? Because some of these things will be privileged. And so what I need to add is actually a become yes true. Now, here's a common mistake people make, is they will add it so that it's part of the task or the module parameters, but this is actually a task level property. So I need to skip up so that I'm at the same level of the task object, right? And if I do this and resave this file, wait for that to say that it was done. Okay. And then run this again, and hopefully this will work. Now, the interesting thing about become is there's all sorts of places where you could put this. So you could put this at the top of the playbook and just basically say everything that you run needs privileges. You could put it just at the task, and you could even put it as a parameter for the playbook when you hit run -b as a parameter. And okay, so we see that this ran successfully. That's pretty cool. And I can even run it again, and it should say that nothing has changed. The downside to putting become at too high of a level is that you may have overspecified your privileges, so that kind of everything that you're doing, all the files you're creating, everything that you're running ends up being owned and kind of operated as root. And you usually don't want that to happen. So I think my personal preference is that become should be used kind of at the lowest level possible. That way you don't accidentally make stuff too basically too much content being owned by root. Okay, so another example that we can get it at is, you saw when we're running all these things that there are situations of where you may want to have the output of a command and use that as part of your logic. And to get into even more complicated situations, sometimes you want to use this in conjunction with things like knowing whether the command is idempotent or not. And so this can get messy, and you'll maybe not have to mess too much with this, but it's just good to know that there are these capabilities for this. And I just want to demo real quick running this. If you look at this example here, it's basically using a simple command to echo each item in this list. And then it's saying that it will consider this task changed if it sees a Z in the output, right? And so what that means is it's just going to print hello, foo, and bye. And none of those contain the Z character. So it's going to consider this change false, right? But if we added a new list entry that said Z, right, then it would say changed, right? And an actual use case where you would use this is something like if you downloaded a file, and if you're looking for a certain line in the standard out that says downloaded or failed, then you could say that you use that to kind of drive the logic of did this fail or not. Okay, so there's an example I'd like you to play with here. And I've already sort of put the answer here, but let me update that real quick. quick. All right, so I have this playbook here, and what's interesting about it is it's basically something that's actually fairly common in the sense of like if you need to download a configuration file, a tarball, or something that's going to be hosted on another site, you often don't want to keep re-downloading it. Not only is that going to be wasteful, it's especially for like a big file, like say it takes a, it's a gig and you don't want to have to re-download that every time you do the thing. Then it means that you need some sort of way of knowing that this thing was idempotent. Now there are fetch modules for Ansible, and when those are possible, you could use it. But I think this is a good opportunity for being able to understand how to write a command and turn it into an idempotent operation. Because there are chances or situations of where there isn't a module available for everything you need to do, and you would like to be able to make this happen. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and look for this example and run it. All right, so I already changed it a tiny bit. So all right, so here's the example of where I'm just using wget to fetch this archive that's hosted on Stack Overflow. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and run this playbook. And so this is in BakerX, examples, and results. Okay. So I'm running this, and all right, then you can see that this file was downloaded. Cool. But what I want to show you is, can I change this so that if the file is already there, that it doesn't rerun the thing? So if I do this again, then you'll notice that the change property is still there. That it still thinks that this task is being doing work each time. All right, so let's edit this file. And I'm going to introduce the register concept. So there's this idea that if you run a command, can you save the output to a variable? And that's what register does. So in this case, it's going to register the output of this command into this variable. And I'm going to paste some of this because not something I remember offhand. And what I'm going to use is I'm going to use this built-in module, which is stat, to get the file and information about a file. And I'm giving it the path parameter, which is just saying in the destination directory, which is temp, and then the file I'm downloading, and put the information about that into the stat variable. Okay. And then the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add a when command. And so what the when command will do is it will basically allow me to pass a Python expression that says whether something is evaluated as true or false, right? And so what it's going to do is it's going to says if this condition is true, then run the command, right? And so in this case, what I can do is I could look at when the file stat exist is not true, right? So if that file doesn't exist, then it will run this little snippet. I believe this needs to be in quotes, depending on the stuff I put. Okay, so I'm going to try this again, and hopefully there's no parse errors. Oh, maybe a little bit. Okay, so let's read what this says. Okay, I misindented my line. So let's go back to that. So this should be at the same level of the top level task property, right? So that was a little boo-boo. Okay, oh, some more boo-boos. So again, remember I mentioned that quotes, that variables now need quotes. So we're going to do that. All right, and now that you see, I was able to get my information about the file, and then you see this new thing where it says skipping because the when condition was false because the file already existed, and so it's going to skip that. And so you could see I was able to control the flow of tasks being run. So I think between all the things I just showed you, that gives you a sense of the different types of things that you can do. And it gets much more complicated and you could do lots of cool stuff. But at the end of the day, it is no more simple than just running commands on a remote server that are, in this case, specified as modules, but those are really translated into Python scripts that just get run on the remote machine and will do all the logic that you need. And it has some sense of whether knowing that command changed the state of the system or not and reporting that back to you. And when it turns out when you get into a bigger, working on bigger systems, you need some sort of way to lay out all the content that you have. It's not enough to just have a playbook. And so a common pattern is to use roles. And so the way that you might do roles is you basically are just splitting up the task that you have into smaller files and maybe splitting out things like templates and variables into these things. So if you were to think about what your typical folder layout may look like in a project that involves more configuration, then it might be something like this. You'll have a top level playbook or playbooks that you might run. And then you would have this roles directory. And then in that is going to be a subdirectory of each role. And within a role itself, there will be a task directory that describes each set of tasks that you're going to be running and any other files like variables and stuff specific to those roles. And then when you go to your playbook, what will happen is instead of including a top level task object, you could still do this, but don't typically do. You'll have a roles object, and then you basically just give a list of all the roles that you're using, and it will just run all the tasks associated with those roles, just kind of one after the other. And there are, of course, ways that you could say skip certain roles based on when conditions, just like you do for task. All sorts of extra things you can do with roles. But the neat thing is this helps you keep more organized, so you don't have this kind of really big, long playbook that gets real messy. So this is kind of just your most basic hello world for Ansible playbooks. And hopefully this is useful for you to understand what's going on. All right, thanks.